Welcome, everyone. Well, today we have a great guest. I'm really interested in this topic. It's called left side cradle bias. You're going to find out all about it in a little bit, but it's really a fascinating topic that doesn't get as much coverage as I really wish it did. And with us today is Dr. Lucas Tomasi. He's coming from the University of Chieti in Italy. That's right. We have two Italian guests this week. It's really great. And he's going to be talking to us about all his research on the left side cradle bias, which I'm really excited about. Before we get started, if you make sure to support us, to share and subscribe to the podcast, and check out our YouTube channel as well. If you haven't visited there, Dr. Carlos Circle of Insight, and check out our episodes over there. Let's not waste any more time and welcome to the show, Dr. Tomasi. Welcome, sir.
Hi, Dr. Carlos. Thanks for having me in your show. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for being here. So this is a fascinating topic. I was reading about it probably just a few months ago when I started learning really about the impact of left side cradle bias. So my first question to you is, what got you studying left side cradle bias?
Well, I got to this topic moving, so to say, from animal psychology, which was my first love. I'm a psychologist. Got a degree and then the PhD studying lateralization, hemispheric lateralization in birds. This was in northern Italy. Then I moved to central Italy to this university, which I'm now since 20 years, more or less. And since there was no animal facility, I had to study humans. And this is the reason why I approached the lateralization and hemispheric and perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral lateralization in humans. I discovered actually the bias, the left cradle bias, more or less 15 years ago, which slowly attracted me, and it's now become, I wouldn't say my main topic of research, but one of my most favorite ones, because it's really intriguing and really puzzling. That's the reasons why. I have a sort of a biological psychology background, and I think this type of behavioral bias is really a concentrate of interesting aspects dealing with biological traits, psychological aspects of personality also, and everyday biases that we are not aware of. So studying laterality, one would think of things like the split brains or stuff that one usually studies in the lab or in very rare occasions. I also study split brain patients, but I'm more interested in the ecological aspects of lateralization. So the observation of naturally occurring biases, to me, was a very intriguing aspect to put together an ethological approach and a neuroscientific approach. Because the bias, as I will tell you, depends on aspects of hemispheric lateralization, of the way our brains are designed, so to say.
It's fascinating stuff. It's really fascinating. And can you tell people, and by the way, for those who are not, how would you say, familiar with some of the terms, lateralization, he's talking about left and right side of the brain. But can you tell us a little bit, what is left side cradle bias?
Yeah, sure. It's a very simple asymmetry in our behavior. Actually, I shouldn't say our, because it's very specific asymmetry of motor behavior that is observed especially in women. So perhaps most of us, and even women that are, the protagonists, so to say, of this story, are not aware of the bias. That is the tendency to hold babies, to cradle babies on the left side of the body, using the left arm and the left hand to hold babies, especially during non-functional activities, which means not necessarily while breastfeeding, for instance. So while simply holding the baby, the infant or the newborn, especially women have this tendency that they are not aware of to hold the child, the infant, on the left side. This is also present in males, but it's much less pronounced as an asymmetry, because in females and especially in mothers, you can observe it around 70% of the entire population. In males, you can see the bias, but it is either non-significantly skewed toward the left, so it might be 55%, or it is in any case lesser than what is observed in women. So this is the basic observation that was made sort of serendipitously in 1960 by Dr. Lee Salk, who was a developmental psychologist working in maternity wards in New York hospitals. And he observed this motor asymmetry and connected it in the first interpretation he gave, and actually it was published quite well in even in Scientific American as a sort of a curiosity that opened an entire scenario for research, and he connected it to the fact that, in his opinion, the bias was due to the closeness of the baby to the mother's heart. So he assumed that the heartbeat of the mother would be the cause of the laterality, of this tendency to hold the baby, to cradle the baby on the left side. Unfortunately, however, he was not correct, because despite the original explanation might sound very romantic and poetic in a way, it was to be demonstrated that it was not tenable as an explanation. Actually, I found also the heartbeat explanation very intriguing in a way, because Dr. Salk explained the bias because of this heartbeat reason, connecting the fact that during pregnancy, the baby, the fetus is exposed mostly to auditory and tactile stimulation. So he assumed that the sound of the heartbeat of the mother would be a very important stimulus during pregnancy, and assumed that it continued to have a soothing effect also postnatally. And he sort of imagined that there would be a sensitive period after birth during which the sound of the heartbeat would act more or less like an imprinting stimulus. So I was, coming from work with animal psychology and imprinting in birds, I found these explanations very fascinating. But as I said, it was, the fate of this explanation quite soon had to be changed to other explanations. Of course, one of the first explanations that come to mind is the fact that holding the baby on the left side would be due to the fact that the mother, the person, the caregiver, has the dominant hand free for doing other things. So what I find puzzling is that every explanation that has been given has been then falsified, because the explanation of the heartbeat, so to say, fell because of further research done by others in the 1970s. And this intuitive explanation of the left side due to the fact that the right hand is left free was soon to fall also, because in fact left-handed women also cradle their babies on the left. So the fact that the dominant hand is left free for doing other things, for manipulation, for gesturing, is false. So the topic became more and more intriguing in a way after excluding further explanations. One other explanation that was provided also in the 70s, in the 80s, was due to the fact that newborns, when they are born and they are lay supine, they have a natural spontaneous tendency to turn the head rightward. So this is called asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And this is a natural reflex of newborns of turning the head toward the right. So someone imagined that the spontaneous tendency to turn the head on one side, on the side of the baby, would offer, so to say, an easier grasp on the side of the mother to hold the baby on the left side. But this was also falsified. I mean, there are demonstrations that the bias is not, the cradling bias is not due to this further reason. Actually, I believe that all these reasons perhaps are reasonable and might have a part in the equation that, in a way explains the bias. But more recently, in the 90s, the most acknowledged explanation, which is the one that I tend to advocate, is based on differences in the way the brain of the child and the mother process information. So if you imagine holding a baby on the left side, the hemispheric explanation, how it is called, is soon explained. Holding the baby on the left means that the mother sees the baby in her left visual field, and the left visual field is more strongly controlled by the right hemisphere of the brain of the mother. And we know that the right hemisphere is more relevant and, so to say, dominant in processing emotions. So there is an advantage in keeping the baby on the left due to the fact that the mother would monitor the behavior of the baby and the emotional state of the baby more precisely and more accurately due to this stronger connection with the right hemisphere. Another reason why the hemispheric hypothesis is fascinating and is still acknowledged is the fact that the left side of the mother's face, also because of these stronger connections with the right hemisphere, is more expressive. So when we express emotions, we are not symmetrical in our face. Due to the fact that the right hemisphere controls the production and the manifestation of our emotions, and due to the fact that the hemispheres are connected to the two sides of the face in a crossed manner, so to say, the left side of our faces usually expresses more strongly our emotions. You can, check these looking at pictures of people smiling or people with a sad or angry face, and see that the two sides of the face are differently expressing the emotions. There's one side which is more intense, and that is the left side of the face connected to the right hemisphere. So to go back to the cradling, during cradling on the left side of the mother's face is closer to the baby, so it's more conveying more strongly conveying her expressions. So this is one of the reasons, because the hemispheric explanation, in my opinion, because this is still pretty much a debated topic, but it's one very good reason which has been tested in many ways and has been confirmed in many ways, in laboratory, in studies using stimuli composed of faces with different halves, and correlating the what we call the laterality quotient, which is an index of the amount of work that the two hemispheres do in a single person on emotional material, on stimuli that are, for instance, emotional faces. There is a strong correlation between the left cradling bias and the right hemispheric activity for processing emotions.
That's amazing stuff. I had to put you on mute for a second. My cat's meowing. That's really amazing stuff. So it brought up a lot of questions for me now. First question I guess right after the start is affect regulation. Is that going to play a role then? Is that helping the baby? Is this the right side of the brain, communication between the mom and the baby? Is that something that's getting impacted as well as their emotional regulation here?
Yeah, definitely there is a role in affect regulation, in socio-affective, we call it regulation between the mother and the child. Of course, during the first months of life of the infant, of the newborn and then the infant, you have, the period in which the attachment to the primary caregiver, which usually is the mother, is the strongest. So the reciprocal interaction is really driven by stimuli that are acoustic, so the auditory domain, visual, and prosodic in terms of acoustic stimuli. The newborn, of course, and then the very young infant do not speak yet, but they produce prosodic and vocalizations that are so to say conveying their emotional state, their needs, and this is really depending on the processing of the right hemisphere. Well, when I say that, right hemisphere is dominant in emotion processing, it's not the whole story. We know that the right hemisphere has a major role in processing social information. So it's no surprise that, the earliest social activity of a newborn is the interaction with the mother. And so the regulation of emotions and the fact that there exists a bias that brought human individuals to unawarely choose the side which has this strong effect for communication, for the affective regulation between mother and child, is no chance. It's definitely a trait which should be studied for its biological importance, for its relevance in the long run, and this is what we are trying to do. Because to complete the answer to your question, what we know now is that the left cradling bias is associated, and this has been shown also by research in my group, to higher levels of empathy, to better levels of attachment to the mother especially, and to the romantic partner. And these are tests done with young women who are asked, in the empirical way, you can test for cradling, just offering a doll and observing which side, with the repeated trials, you observe which side the doll is held by the participant. So, to run experiments in an easy way, we have to recur to laboratory measures. It's nice to observe the bias in nature, in field studies, but it's of course less possible to make empirical predictions, to make controlled experiments. But in the lab, we usually run experiments on cradling with hundreds of participants who are simply asked to hold the doll which is offered to them or which lays on a table, and they have to pick it up and cradle it, and we observe which side, and then we administer psychological tests, like tests for empathy, for alexithymia, for depression. And what is interesting is that the higher the level of left cradling, so the higher the tendency to cradle on the left, the best are the results in terms of empathy. So the women who cradle on the left are more empathic, are more attached to the mother, or reveal in a way that their attachment to the mother is best, using tests for parental attachment, and best attached to their romantic partner, to their current partner. And on the other side, I mean, the more they cradle on the right, the less they are attached to the mother and the more to the father. They're less empathic. And we have confirmed data that had been collected since the 1980s that they tend to be more depressed and more prone to suffer from anxiety. So, I mean, it might...
Who's the mother, the father, or the child express more depression and anxiety?
The mother. So the more anxious mothers and the more depressed the more anxious or depressed is the mother, the more likely it will be that they will hold the baby on the right side. This, of course, opens a real intriguing but also slippery scenario, because as you can understand, providing data that are so simply, interesting, because it's just a matter of left and right, but observing associations with positive behavior and negative behaviors, you might, of course, immediately think that it could be a good advice or a good practice to suggest to holding babies on the left. And this opens, I think, another intriguing avenue, in terms of practices of nursing and simple advice that could be given. Having also studied not only me and my group, but other groups, having studied the association of a cradling bias with autism symptoms in autistic children and in normotypical adults, it came out that, for instance, if you compare a group of the bias is observable also in babies. So if you ask a 5-year-old girl to hold a doll, she will hold it on the left. So the bias is present since very early during the childhood, which means that it must have some genetical origin, and it's not very much, it's not likely that it's deriving from learning or from observation, or not only from that. But if you compare, the cradling bias, shown manifested by normal children, normotypical children, and children with mental retardation and children with autism, you will see that the normotypical children and the mentally retarded children will hold the baby on the left. The only group which won't show the bias is the autistic children. So this was an observation by South African researchers some years ago, which found some sort of replication also in adults, because someone studied the association of the cradling bias with the autistic traits in normal adults, finding that the more autistic traits, the more the right cradling bias was observed. And this series of elements is sort of a puzzle, in my opinion, because there are, really inputs from many aspects of clinical psychology, developmental psychology, evolutionary psychology that are put together in a fascinating way. So I guess you have more questions. I don't want to speak and to jeopardize the show.
No, it's wonderful, because you're leading me for a lot of other questions as we go through. It's really a fascinating topic. Again, folks, it's Dr. Lucas Tomasi from the University of Chieti over in Italy, talking about left side cradle bias. Really a fascinating conversation. I guess my next question, there's a couple of them, I'm trying to see which one I'm going to ask first. I know you mentioned a little bit early on about the right side being the side where it processes emotion. And if I'm correct, the right side is actually more fully developed at that young age, in those first few months, than the left side. Is that true?
Yeah, true. Also because of the fact that, as we know, the left side of the brain is responsible for language, so it's definitely less developed until the age at which language starts to fully develop, or to be, in its early forms in the child. Of course, also the left hemisphere is also responsible for handedness. I mean, in the majority of people who are right-handed, is the left hemisphere in control of the dominant hand. But we know that in newborns and in infants until the age of 4, more or less, handedness is not fully developed, which is another reason why the left hemisphere, which will control later the dominant hand, is not fully developed. And there are interesting, connections between the development of handedness, the development of language, the development of motor abilities and cognition that, in my opinion, perhaps I'm exaggerating because this is my beloved topic. But that might depend in a way on the crucial time window when child are taken care of specifically by the mother and specifically with this strong bias. Because the left cradling bias is very strong during the first 3, 4, 5 months of life. Then it decreases. And then, of course, as the child gets older and more heavy and heavier, it becomes more natural that it's not held in the arms. So you will observe the stronger bias during the first months of life, and that's really the time window where I believe the building blocks of the lateralization of the brain are built, are put together. To give you, what I believe is a very fascinating analogy that we find in comparative neuroscience. We know, for instance, and this has been discovered in the 70s last century by an Australian colleague, Leslie Rogers, that birds that when they're adults, they have a lateralized brain, but this lateralization, which is, despite the fact that avian and human brains are very different, but still they have 2 hemispheres. The fact that we have 2 hemispheres is very well conserved across vertebrates, bilateral vertebrates. But avian lateralization has been studied, and it has been discovered that depends pretty much on environmental inputs. And to be more precise, this environmental input depends on the exposure of the chick during its life in the egg, exposure to light. So when a chick is inside the egg, it has a sort of a rigid position. So all chicks are more or less in the same position, exposing the right eye towards the egg shell. And the egg shell is not completely opaque. It's translucent. So the light can enter. And this simple exposure to light will create the laterality in the brain. So this, to me, is a very fascinating example of epigenetic causation, in which the young brain has not yet reached structural differences or functional differences. It's so to say undifferentiated in terms of left and right. So just the effect of the light will make the choice at the bifurcation. So the cheek will become lateralized. In fact, if you occlude the eye or just prevent the cheek to be in the egg with the light, so if you exclude the light, you will have cheek hatching without lateralization. So to me, this analogy is very intriguing, is very special, because if the simple effect of light exposure in birds can give rise to a difference in the structure of the brain, so the same, in my opinion, can happen in humans depending on exposure to a social environment, to the niche which is constituted by the very early attachment with the mother. And the fact that there is this left-sided bias might have, by analogy, similar effects and cascading effects as the exposure to light in birds. And just one simple, addition, we know that in birds, during, when the eggs are, have been deposed, the chicken, for instance, will regulate the quantity of light that is accessed by in the egg, just by moving to and from the eggs, so regulating the amount of light. So this is perhaps totally unaware for the chicken, but it's a regulation, a control of the the environmental input that will have an impact on the brain shaping and the sculpting of the laterality of the brain. I'm taking different avenues.
It's amazing, the neurobiological connection. And it's also going to be harder for me to have eggs now, by the way. But either way. But the neurobiology connection is amazing, how much of an impact, because I'm thinking as you're talking, you talked about earlier the affect regulation, how that's going to affect the vagus nerve and how we respond to stress, external stress from the environment. That's going to affect our HPA, right? The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary and adrenal gland area. All those things are going to be affected in one capacity or another. And it's interesting too, before I forget, sometimes that happens. I know that I deal a lot with criminal psychopathology. So as we were talking about empathy, I started thinking about psychopaths and how they don't have empathy. Usually that area of the brain doesn't operate properly compared to everybody else. And it's interesting because I love to see, maybe someday, see a study on the correlation between a left side cradle bias and anything kind of influencing their lack of empathy. But I guess my next question would be, parts of the brain, do we know anything in specifics? We know the left and right brain, but on the right side, do we see more influence on the orbital frontal cortex, on the amygdala, anything like that at all?
Well, research on, the brain centers that regulate, attachment towards own children and towards offspring in general is at its very early stages. We know for sure from neuroimaging data that the mothers have a very strong effect in activation of their reward centers, and you have mentioned, the orbitofrontal cortex, and I would add also parts of the basal ganglia that are also activated by simple vision of your own child. Actually, there has been no attempt to put together, which brain centers control this laterality of the cradling bias. This is something that should be done because, the bias has become popular, and also the neuroimaging of the mother-infant dyad is becoming more and more intriguing and, so to say, popular as a topic in research. So I would expect that centers that control, for example, the expression of oxytocin, so the hormones that regulate, we know, not only the contractions during delivery, but also the attachment that follows. So the affiliative behavior that mothers express towards their child might have a role. So also others centers in the reward circuits that make, in particular, your own children special as an entity in the world, but more in general, we have data showing that children are a special stimulus. Actually, according to the etologist, the baby facedness, the traits that are, softer and more round shaped in children define what Konrad Lorenz called a super stimulus. So a sort of a stimulus that is so strong for us that it enhances our attention, enhances our memory, enhances our tendency to also to affiliative behavior. So definitely that's an avenue for further research. To go back, however, to the question, to the point of the psychopaths, the left cradling bias has not been studied in psychopathology to the point that we have data on, on psychopaths or on criminology. But I mean, the fact that stress induces, so to say, a disruption in the left cradling bias, and I mentioned anxiety and depression, but also the level of stress, environmental stress, changes the side that the babies are held, has been studied in South Africa very recently, in a region which is very, so to say, environmentally dangerous. And in such situation, the cradling bias was disrupted. This was field study, so the observations were naturalistic, and the researchers observed people on the street, mothers and fathers carrying children, holding children, and differently from, I would say 100 of other field studies that have been carried out in that specific situation, which is characterized by extreme danger. We are talking about slums in I don't remember which suburban areas, but characterized by violence and poverty. So, I would call it a general, stressful situation. The left cradling bias was disrupted. You didn't see a left cradling bias, but a random tendency to cradle the babies. I wouldn't put, this brings me to a very delicate aspect, because, I wouldn't never, put a causal role, to the fact that children held on the left then grow happy and better than children that are held on the right when they were newborns or infants. But still, I consider it as a marker, as a sort of an index of the level of the quality of the affective interaction, of the affective interplay between mother and child. Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, it's definitely a contributing factor. There's no doubt about that with social engagement. Question for you, curiosity, and I know we have about 10 minutes left, but a question that came up when you talked about that stress in South Africa and the environment that they were in, why do you think they flipped to the right? I'm looking at evolutionary principles for self-defense. If you're right-handed, maybe that's one reason, but that doesn't make any sense because you're holding them on the right side. So I'm really trying to figure out why the mom would switch like that. Is there any ideas why they would switch sides?
Well, actually, if I'm finding explanations of the left cradling bias because of this hemispheric asymmetry, I would see the reverse condition as a disruption in the, as an effect of a disruption in the affective relationship between mother and child, or between father and child, because this disruption has been observed also in males in that South African region. Actually, I don't think that, again, there is a causal relationship. I think that sometimes these lateral biases, and we know many biases that are, so to say, elusive, but they are there. If you observe naturalistically, people, for instance, embracing or kissing each other, you will see a bias in turning the head toward the right side when embracing, or which is modulated by the emotional state. So the baseline of people kissing, for instance, when greeting at airports or on the street when they are meeting, is turning the head toward the right. And this must be reciprocal. Both have to turn their head right if they want to kiss properly and not to bump into each other. But if the situation becomes more, so to say, romantic, and so it is emotionally loaded, then the the kiss turns to be on the left side by both participants in the kiss. So there is an emotional modulation of the lateral bias in many instances, like kissing, cradling, embracing, or choosing which seat you want to choose in a cinema or in a classroom. That it depends on the valence of the specific situation of the context. So I guess that might explain also this change, this turning to the right in the South African experiment.
Fascinating stuff. And I guess my last question you kind of answered already, or maybe you're doing research now on looking to see if it does impact the baby in the long term. Does it have an impact on their psychological development? Does it give them a propensity for certain psychopathologies, like maybe they develop depression and anxiety? And I know it's kind of hard to extrapolate that from left cradle bias compared to other issues that may be happening in the environment itself. But are we looking into studies in that?
That's a very, very important question, because if we want to have some grasp of the thing we study, we have to observe the effects in the long run. However, there has been very little research on the long-term effect of the cradling bias, which brings me to give you a couple of examples, because there are some examples. One is very, so to say, simple example, and all examples have to do with observation which is done retrospectively. So if you ask a person to check the pictures in his or her family photo album, then he or she might be able to find the pictures where he or she was held in the arms of his or her mother. So this allows you to do a retrospective study, having as a variable whether the person, now adult, was held on the left or on the right, and then you can test any psychological measurement on the adult person. And actually, there have been very few studies in this way, done in this way. One is a Dutch study which studied the laterality quotient. I guess I imagine this is not a very fascinating aspect, but it's a very specific aspect of the way people process emotions when they're adults. And we know, as I told you before, that when we see a face, due to the fact that our brain hemisphere controls the perception of emotions in other people's faces, when we see another person's, we tend to gaze to the left side of the face, which is, falling more in our left visual field. So what we see on the left of the face we have in front. So usually, people like me, you, normal people would have a very rightward laterality index in terms of this specific task. So researchers have correlated this index with the index of cradling derived from the photographic album in their families. So the people, but to put it short, people who had been cradled on the left tend to have this laterality quotient in a normal value, which is they tend to use more the left side of other people's faces. And people who were cradled on the right tend to have, a random laterality quotient when they are measured with this hemispheric measure of laterality of emotions. So this is a first example that there is a long-term effect, which means left side cradling brings to what I would call a normotypical laterality index in hemispheric processing of emotions. And what we did was, again, with the photographic album, we looked at autistic people, so asking their mothers to check their photographic albums and comparing the cradling bias in mothers of people who have been diagnosed autistic with the photographic albums of a control group of mothers. Of course, you understand that this is when the topic becomes very slippery, because asking this question to the mothers, you run the risk of suggesting them that due to the fact that they held the baby on one side, they might have, so to say, provoked or caused or, increased the likelihood of making their baby autistic. However, the results of the experiment didn't go in that way. I mean, we found actually that during the 6 months comparing the mothers of the autistic children and the non-autistic children, during the first 6 months of life, I mean, looking at the pictures, there was a similar left cradling bias. And actually, on the contrary, during the following 3 months, the mothers of the autistic children actually cradled on the left even more. And perhaps we explain that as due to the appearance of the first symptoms of autism in their children, and this might have reinforced, a left cradling bias, which is, as said before, the condition in which the socio-affective behavior by the mother is expressed. Perhaps this was expressed more in response to the lack of responsiveness by the baby. So, but this again is where the research becomes very, very difficult, because you have to, so to say, run against the obstacle of the psychological attribution of effects to very simple causes or very simple conditions. Still, I believe that it's not a cause, it's a marker, it's an index of good, quality communication and interaction between mother and child. But that's definitely one avenue that will have to be taken, studying, the bias with more sophisticated ways and with technologies that allow, for instance, to measure the amount of movement, the amount of visual information that enters in the communication between the mother and the child. So there is stuff for working for other 30, 40 years, and perhaps without solving the puzzle.
Job security, right, Professor?
Yeah.
Job security for now. That's really amazing. I can definitely see the problems of that and psychological attributions, because you could, people will jump to conclusions, but I can see it as a contributing factor, no doubt. It's amazing. As I take this journey, we're doing a series of interviews during this period of time of human development, and it's amazing how many things affect us. When we had Dr. Dorenzo from Italy talking about the placenta and how those differences are going to make an impact. And then we're going to have Dr. Weinberger tomorrow about placenta and the schizophrenia. And it's really amazing how important that perinatal time period is, and the postnatal as well. So great work. You're doing some great stuff for everybody out there. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come onto the show.
Thank you. No, I'm thanking you for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you.
I'm very happy that this very, very small aspect of our everyday life, so to say, becomes more visible and less unaware of.
Oh, absolutely. It's so important, because I keep seeing it over and over again. Like I told you, every time I continue to do the research for my own work, I see this coming up all the time, how much of an impact those early months and even during the pregnancy have on us. And hopefully we can make a better future for everybody here on the world by just understanding that a lot better.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully. Once again, Dr. Lucas Tomasi from the University of Chieti. Folks, a fascinating discussion on left side cradle bias. If you're just catching it right now, you can always go back and rewind and listen to it. If you want to support our podcast, make sure to share and subscribe. We thank everyone for listening.